Well, I want to thank NCLF for inviting me to speak. Had the pleasure of speaking last year as well, and specifically, Joy Guo and Wei also for inviting me to this particular panel. So today I'd like to discuss with you a couple of things, and that has to do with the impact on domestic policies related to national security, on Asian Americans. And these policies, again, arise out of US-Asia conflict, but particularly the impact on Asian Americans and their civil rights. And then the other thing is to give you an insight into the community response, meaning, what advocates have been doing in order to raise public awareness and with elected officials, and also to assist those persons who have been injured and are seeking legal representation. So I want to break down those two themes into 7 topic areas. And one is just as a way of introduction, because of the title of our presentation is to briefly touch on the global context, which is the current US-China relations. And also then to go on to talk about why does this matter, and particularly to a pan-Asian American audience, because NCLF has worked very hard to recruit participants from all the different ethnic communities. Number 3 is to talk about the impact on civil rights. 4 is the community response. And then I wanted to share some resources before leaving you with some takeaways, and then ending it on what can I do? Because I recognize this is a very complicated topic that we're going to unpack. And even in this short presentation, there's a lot of information to unpack. So let me get started here. I want to preface the presentation with some caveats. Again, this is an issue that cuts across multiple disciplines: trade, financial investment, intellectual property, national security, foreign policy. And by no means am I, trying to represent myself as an expert in those areas. And I also want to recognize that, when it comes to this issue, a significant amount of information is not available to the public because it's shrouded in national security, right? So what we're doing today is like trying to make sense of what's going on and trying to assist people in navigating what I call the new reality. The other thing I want to say, to acknowledge up front, is that there are real challenges, meaning there are real intellectual property theft, there's real espionage, there's real influence peddling, and by no means in raising the concerns that I'm about to present is to negate what are real serious concerns by the US government, but to really draw focus on a group of Chinese Americans who have been negatively impacted because they're caught in the middle. So my work focuses primarily on US citizens and legal permanent residents. Therefore, while I monitor, I don't spend as much time delving into issues related to immigration that affects the foreign students or visiting professionals, the issues with Huawei or WeChat or the Confucius Institutes, but I am aware because they do sort of play into how this issue plays out for Asian Americans. And my focus specifically is on civil rights, which is a domestic issue. So let's go into the global context. You all are probably aware, but in case there are audience members who are tuning in and don't know, we are in an unprecedented time right now where US PRC relationship has changed in a way that hasn't occurred since the normalization of relations. And they've been precipitated on the PRC side, and especially in the past recent years under the leadership of President Xi. And previous to that, there were sort of 2 schools of thought on the US side, and one was pro-engagement, and they advocated for inclusion of China in the trade organization, the world governance, and so forth, hoping that they would sort of converge into democratization. But in recent years, that didn't come to play, and the concerns by the other group started to dominate. So we are now in a situation where there's a consensus of both those schools of thought, and the other group who wants to take a sharper approach to China has ascended into power. And so those policies that you see today are really driven more from that group. Okay, so very briefly, the concerns are twofold, and it has to do with the loss of US technologies, which impact not only our economy, but our military strength, which relies on a strong economy, and also the influence peddling that has reached into US soil and runs contrary to US values and freedom. The FBI has come out publicly in congressional testimony and also in public statements to warn the US government to mirror the same efforts of the PRC, but on the US side, which is sort of to inform the populace that there is a systematic, concerted, effort to acquire technology and information from the United States. And so, when Christopher Wray, who's the head of the FBI, came out with this terminology about we need to reply with a whole of society approach in a similar way that the PRC did, it just sort of fell in a very clunky way because it just smacked of, this public policy wonkish language. But in fact, what they're trying to say is that they want the public to be more aware and for there to be more protections at every level of universities and government and business. Okay, so why does this matter to us? It matters because there's been a convergence of all things related to China in a way that negatively impacts Chinese Americans. So we draw from the political rhetoric, from the media news headlines, from the misunderstandings by the public of, the differences between Asian Americans and foreign nationals, and then a lack of understanding that there are many different ethnic groups that comprise Asian Americans. And so the impact on the community has been profound. In terms of the investigations, which is what people are very concerned about, you probably have seen in the news like a constant sort of pounding of news about economic espionage or traditional espionage or influence peddling. Those are all different kinds of espionages, and it seems very overwhelming. And in fact, there is 2,000 current FBI investigations. It's not clear how many of that is from abroad as opposed to originating within the United States. There is a very sort of voluminous cyber hacking campaign on a minute-by-minute basis against the United States, and I'm not sure that's included. But that is enough to really stir public angst about the situation. But in terms of economic espionage, which is what a new initiative out of Department of Justice intended to address, there were 44 cases brought under that, and only 1/3 were implicated the federal law that relates to economic espionage. That's 32%. The other relates to other charges related to program fraud and false statement and mail fraud and wire fraud. So then it calls into question, why the investigations, and is there overreach in those investigations and prosecutions? The other answer to why this would matter to all Asian Americans is because this is cyclical, and what we're experiencing is sort of a downturn, that when there's US-Asia conflict, that perpetual foreigner stereotype rears its ugly head. And we've seen this over and over again. And some milestones in history have been tragic, like the incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans, to the 10,000 Chinese Americans in San Francisco Chinatown that were investigated during the McCarthy era, to the more recent bans on travel of those Mesoamericans, and that brings us to today with the newly adjusted situation that I'm going to refer to as US-China strategic competition. So in sum, foreign conflict have real effects on Asian Americans at home. And so I think that what this raises for us as a community is that if it's cyclical and we're living it now and feeling the adverse impact, what can we do to interrupt that cycle so that we mitigate the collateral damage? And the answer might, lie in the fact that, we see different ethnic groups being directly impacted, but what are all the other ethnic communities doing in support of that ethnic group? And I know Joy is interested in hearing more about that later. So in terms of civil rights concerns, I think the general concerns I wanted to share at like a aerial view level is fourfold. And one is the criminalization of China, which Professor Margaret Lewis from Seton Hall University School of Law raised, which is basically that instead of a traditional sort of criminal case where you look at the particularized circumstances of a case, it seems to her that all things related to China, because China is sort of the new Russia in an apparent sort of Cold War situation is at play. So that is problematic again, because if there's someone who looks like the enemy can be mistaken as one. The second is that there has been a very aggressive approach toward identifying and rooting out the threats in the US without really looking to see how that infringes upon the civil rights and civil liberties of minorities like Chinese Americans, and how that can be better balanced, as well as other things that is related to the openness of the science research enterprise, which is sort of outside the scope of this presentation. Also, the third thing is due process, and that means transparency. It's been very difficult to raise concerns without knowing exactly what's going on and who can oversee those decision makers, as well as to hold them accountable for adhering to those protections that are enshrined in our statutes and our Constitution. And lastly, I want to call into question how culturally competent are the federal agencies, given that they might not benefit from diversity of thought and background and experience if in their ranks, and particularly in the management, those upper level officials don't have experiences with the segments of the public that they serve. So I'm going to talk about, I know there's concern about racial profiling. I also want to share with you that there are a couple of reasons why someone can come under investigation. And one of those has to do whether you work for the federal government as an employee or contractor, or you're serving in the armed services, or more relatable to a lot of you are if you are a recipient of federal funds. And a lot of investigations have come down upon people who have received funds from NIH, but there are also people who have received funds from, NSF, DOD, DOE. So it's really any federal agency, but most of the information that the journalists have been able to uncover have been related to NIH. So inside the federal government, if you are in one of those roles, then there are actions that actually are triggers for scrutiny. If you are up for promotion or an overseas assignment, if you have a lab change, if you're up for a periodic review, that will also trigger, more, review of your security clearance, which increasingly are being denied. We don't know the numbers, but we know for contractors, they have really jumped up from like around a 30% denial rate to something in the 60s, whereas for other countries like, Iran, they've actually dropped. All the other countries have sort of dropped. The other thing is that if you're connected to the federal government, you may know about the Insider Threat Program, and that program was rolled out a few years ago in order to mitigate unauthorized access to records. And this came because of these national security breaches by other folks who are not related to Chinese Americans, but just, triggered this program. And lastly, if you're applying for federal funding, now there is increased scrutiny about what you do represent or fail to represent on those applications. Okay, so here are the specific concerns. I won't go through each of them, but the running, themes here are sort of just consistent with what we hope the government would meet in terms of standards, in terms of fairness and oversight, and addressing inclusion instead of discrimination, and also being very balanced with investigations and prosecutions, not engaging in overreach. But in fact, the trend is going sort of in the opposite direction. So I wish I had better news for you, but I don't. I think that the situation has gotten increasingly more dire. The other connection besides a foreign US government connection is a foreign government connection. And you all are probably aware of this now. I would recommend, if you are interested, to look at the Hoover Institution Asia Society report called Chinese Influence in American Interests, because while that came out of a think tank, this is the position that the intelligence community has with respect to what concerns them if people come into contact with foreign nationals. If you come into contact with foreign nationals in China, it may be because you have been invited to give a lecture, to teach class, to do research collaboration, but increasingly, those programs or those travel abroad visits have come under increased scrutiny because of the concerns that the PRC, it has such influence that it's using the universities as its tool to extract technologies that it needs in order to advance their 2050 plan and leap forward into being #1 as a economic and technology power. In the United States, there's scrutiny if people come into contact with the PRC officials, again, who are in embassies because they can dual hat, as an agent. So there's concern about contacts there, as well as certain groups that are perceived by the US government to be under the direct influence of the PRC, even though they may be based in the United States. And this also includes exchange programs. So the specific concerns here are that it then sort of bleeds into guilt by association for people. Many people are immigrants. 2/3 of or 73% of Asian Americans adults are foreign born and are immigrants. They have natural ties, travel, contact, with foreign nationals. So, and participate in ethnic-based organizations. So this is a concern because of the impact on them, as well as warrantless surveillance, which is an issue which broadly Americans share, but is a very powerful tool if a certain ethnic group is under intense scrutiny. So in summary, here are the triggers for scrutiny. And again, you can see that there is a rhyme or reason to how you could fall under scrutiny, particularly where these circles do intersect, that increases the chances that you'll become a person of interest. And then overlaying over that are what are called economic, espionage threat indicators. And there's a whole host of them, but they sort of relate to behaviors and actions that people take. For example, sudden but prolonged, visitation overseas, to give you an example. But the list of those indicators are quite dated, so I'm not sure what is being used today. Okay. So as I mentioned, Chinese Americans are disproportionately affected because a significant number are immigrants and want to maintain those ties. They also have maintained the ties, for example, in research collaboration, which they were previously encouraged to have. And so a lot of them engaged in a prestigious program called the 1,000 Talents program. And so several of those participants are now sort of under investigation if there are other indicators that have made them a person of interest. Because of the concern, the PRC is targeting certain technologies to, again, both legally and illegally obtain from the US. That also impacts Chinese Americans who comprise significant numbers in STEM fields and work in those targeted technologies. Okay, so the community response, they've been multiple. They have included forums that have brought the community together to sort of, again, make sense of what's going on. Increasingly, think tanks, US, Asia, sort of programs, academia has come together, and people trying to inform themselves because it wasn't transparent before. There's significant more information in the last few years. And the media has also jumped on board. So with the aid of the media and more public statements from the government, we've been able to piece together exactly the origination of all these new policies and the investigations. In addition to that, there have been some dialogues with the FBI field offices across the country: Chicago, LA, San Francisco, Minneapolis, Washington, DC, Austin, Houston, and they have brought together, in a panel form, the FBI field offices, the US Attorney's Office, DOJ folks, criminal defense attorneys, community leaders together. And that has been useful to have an exchange, because I can tell you that the two perspectives have been very, very, very different. And I've seen where people are frankly very surprised at how the gap is. So these are helpful to start to bridge those gaps and at least kind of understand where the other is coming from. There's also been advocacy, of which NCLF participated in. Last year there was a legislative visit where people went to members of Congress to lobby their members of Congress, and promote a bill that was a SASTA bill that was to promote roundtables so that science organizations, federal agencies, national security could come together and settle on a standard as to what technology should be protected. There's a lot of conversation right now about, even creating gates around fundamental research, and then there's been pushback with science. But without going into that, that was just sort of one bill, and there have been several which I'll talk about in a moment. In terms of legal representation, people have been seeking lawyers. I can recommend there's one webinar that I found extremely helpful by Paul Thaler, Shanlin Wu, and Frank Wu. If you want to email me, I can shoot you that presentation. There have been prominent lawyers, at the forefront of this. Peter Zeinberg, Brian Sun, whose photos that I put here. And, we are also trying to create a referral network through a nonprofit in Washington, D.C. called Asian Americans Advancing Justice. I think for the sake of time, I'm going to just quickly run through the other slides. This, I'm not asking you to absorb the information, but I just want to leave you with the impression there have been a lot of changes in agency regulations, proposed bills, and so forth, but they have come out of a motive in order to, counter the efforts of what they see as strategies by the PRC. And I think maybe the two takeaways here are that of intense focus are the 1,000 Talents program, which has created a lot of concern. And so while public statements say that they are permissible, they really are not. Okay, so here are some resources that I wanted to leave with you. There have been a lot of conferences, summits, research, roundtables, and so forth. These represent diversity of views. If you are interested, again, I'm happy to share them with you, just so that you understand why you may be hearing sort of these different perspectives at play when it comes to these issues. Okay. So the takeaways, I think, I won't go through this one by one, but I just wanted to say that, while the shift in US policy toward China has created broad changes, and they overall are there to protect US interests, there does seem to be a driving force that's sort of overwhelming the domestic landscape to the point where it's triggered concerns about infringements on civil rights and civil liberties. And in part, it's, we've heard from the national security officials that they are a signal, sort of like a public messaging to the PRC that the US is really digging down and taking these issues seriously. So the problem for us as a community is that that then comes at the expense of Chinese Americans, and particularly those who may be responsible for violations, but not to the degree that it rises to espionage or economic espionage. The other thing I would say is that in the past year, there's been increasing political rhetoric and politicization of the federal government, which has really undermined the confidence and trust in agencies like the Department of Justice. Which I'm really sad to say. But as an advocate, I can say that there are pockets and also champions and people who are earnest about trying to do the right thing. So I find it hard to indict the entire US government, and I want you to hold on to hope that there are people who are willing to, even if it's incrementally, move toward progress. But I will say that those champions tend to be holdovers, okay, from the previous administration. And with the recent edict coming from the White House that bans the ability for the federal agencies to address things like implicit bias training, cultural competency training, equity audits, and so forth, that basically makes my work impossible. So I just wanted to leave that with you there. Okay. So what can I do? I would say get informed and recognize the nuances, just as the same way that we say do not blanket, the PRC as with one stereotype, or the China with one stereotype, because there are people, there's the PRC. Also do the same with the US government. I know it's very difficult, but we will not be able to connect in ways that improve the situation if we don't understand the nuances. The second thing is to engage in participation and to build coalitions, particularly with other ethnic groups. The third is to educate the public about Asian Americans, because we're at a threshold level where people do not even understand that, for example, the COVID carriers are not the Americans here in the United States, much less that, say, like the Burmese family that was attacked in Texas, because it was perceived that they were carrying the COVID-19 were not Chinese, but they were Burmese. And then lastly, we also have to deal not only with being under scrutiny by our own government, but we've not even touched upon the challenges from overseas by the PRC government that is targeting the diaspora in the United States. So on a hopeful note, this is a quote that I have said that at different public panels, and that was affirmed to me by one of these FBI officials, which is that even though we feel like we're treated like the problem, we are not the problem. We are the solution. We have the talent, the resources, in order to raise the competitiveness of the US. And so only together will we rise above this. And so I just want to leave that with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariane, for your tireless effort to help bring the community with the policyholders, bridge the community with the policyholders to create a better environment for our community and to empower us with all the resources to deal with the increasingly adverse environment for us. So I really like your saying, we are the solution. I think that's very powerful. Now we're turning the floor to Dr. Wei He, and she will give us her takes on the impact of emerging US sanction on China in cross-continental trade and investment.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you, Ariane. Thanks for inviting me here tonight to have this good conversation with everyone. Here's some background information about myself. I used to work in JP Morgan Chase and supposed to contribute most of my precious and productive lifetime to this private company's revenue to gain. And then I realized that I couldn't find much value to that. So I was looking for something that I could do to make me feel my time is better spent and more people's life touched and some real impact made. So I have been a community activist, and I discovered that I could well utilize my expertise in global sanctions and export controls to help our community, especially those who have engaged in US-China or cross-continental partnership, business collaboration, scientific partnership to better understand this area. So, so we founded, with Joy's help, another big thank you to Joy, I founded Infinity Institute. We have got tremendous help from other colleagues and friends as well. Joy is sitting on our board. We have other board members who come from legal or compliance background. Some have international business background. Some have very strong background in strategizing, strategic planning and fundraising. So we're pretty well supported. We have been able to help some companies and organizations to better understand the ins and outs of sanction-related law enforcement, compliance, and gauge the larger picture, the larger context of it, and understand the long-term outlook of sanction landscape. So, what I'm gonna talk about today is is going to focus on sanctions. It's not like the a broad picture Ariane just laid out for us. We're gonna go deep in this particular area. With that being said, I'm going to talk about some basics of sanctions. And then I'll focus on a few sanction legislations to illustrate to you how our community could be impacted. It could be just particular groups who have involved in this cross-continental collaboration. It could be a lot of us, the majority of us could be impacted by these sanctions. Okay. Let me go to my next slide. Okay. So sanctions, they're foreign policy tools. So if you are familiar with laws, and you'd say that although a lot of sanction related laws that passed as laws, but they actually a lot of times contradict with some international laws. Sanctions, they are restrictions in travel, in trade, and etc. And they are usually, historically, they're used as alternative to wars. Now in the current administration, the Trump administration has expanded these measures in multiple fronts. They adopt strategies to disrupt the global supply chain in critical tech areas by restricting the access of Chinese competitors to critical areas related to national security. The larger picture is that, as some famous people have said, the wars between countries now not more about technology, about data, about AI, that kind of a technology, to collect, analyzing data. So it's less about the number of warheads one country holds. Now we have observed sanctions used as means for the purpose of decoupling in the areas that have been deemed of national significance, national security significance. The most well-known cases, as we know, are Huawei, ZTE, MATLAB, and WeChat, TikTok. Another front in expansion is end user cleansing. The list of Chinese end users that US persons are restricted to sell is growing longer and longer, including many prestigious academic and research institutions in China. Their US partners got confused sometimes about the fast-growing list and don't quite understand the end user issues they have alleged involved in. Now, alternatives to war, its traditional use of sanctions. It's mostly pertaining to contested territory, disputes, nuclear weapon proliferation, human rights, and terrorism. US recently passed legislations and enacted executive orders addressing Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Uyghur-related issues. Some are symbolic, some constitute weapons like nuclear option, which could have power of mass destruction. What I want to focus on today is Hong Kong Autonomy Act. The reason is the enforcement of this act could have far-reaching implications on international trade, hence potentially carries huge consequences on the business and investment communities in the US that have involved in US-China trade. They have benefited from the old globalization order that the current administration is trying to dismantle. Okay, next page. Hong Kong Autonomy Act, here is a deep dive into it. It primarily targets persons and entities that materially, quote unquote, contribute to the failure of the government of China to meet its obligations under the Joint Declaration of Basic Rights of the Person, take actions that resulted in the inability of the people in Hong Kong enjoy freedom, pursue democracy, and high degree of autonomy, and achieve high degree of autonomy. So as you could say, the definition of the target is ambiguously broad. It could include China's highest decision-making body, the Standing Committee, their core members in charge of Hong Kong affairs. It could mean all the companies that share private citizens' data to the government, of long list including telecom companies, social media like WeChat and other data collecting companies, companies using AI to monitor activities, as well as their partners in supply chain, in their supply chain. So what distinguished this act to the previous act US has imposed on China is that it includes 10 restrictions that penalize any financial institutions doing significant transactions with the targeted persons or entities. It's showing here. It can potentially induce a financial war and largely block international trade related to Hong Kong. Among the 10 restrictions, 2 of them are swift tools to reduce US dollar liquidity in Hong Kong, which are prohibit foreign exchange transactions and prohibit banking transactions subject to US jurisdictions. And US jurisdiction here hinge on the use of US dollar. The transaction of US dollar would most likely go through banks located in New York or other locations in the States. This process established US nexus that put global financial institutions at every corner of this world under US jurisdiction. So these global financial institutions have learned their lesson in a hard way. Now they have invested billions of dollars every year in sanction and anti-money laundering compliance to avoid being cut off from US dollar clearance circle and US market. The ultimate impact would be if these restrictions are imposed on a large number of financial institutions in Hong Kong, especially those major Chinese banks, then these banks would be blocked access to obtain US dollars in a foreign exchange market, or the right to sell US dollars it owns. They would find it difficult, if not impossible, to transfer or make use of it in global market, which disable their capacity to adopt monetary policy in case they have to defend Hong Kong's dollar peg to US dollar. If the peg become undermined, Hong Kong dollar would lose its prestige as a global currency. In that case, a financial war could break out. Now, in other fronts, the world's largest undersea web cable that Google and Facebook have been supported is excluding Hong Kong. On top of all the other legislations and measures that removed Hong Kong special trading status, a financial war would bring unthinkable disruptions to Hong Kong's functioning as a global trading hub. All of this would lead to direct consequences on US business and investment communities that have deeply involved in Hong Kong-US cross-continental partnership. How has the law been enforced? Okay. On the same day, the Hong Kong Autonomy Act was signed into law. Trump signed an executive order based on this act and the previously passed Hong Kong human rights and democracy law and other laws. OFAC designated 11 individuals soon after that. Carrie Lam was one of them. However, as broad as the definition of targeted person could be, none of the 11 individuals were from the core circle of the decision makers in the central government of China. And no state-owned or private companies are on the list. You could say the sanction carried out under this order so far has been a very much calibrated measure. These individuals could well fit into the definition of target in Hong Kong Autonomy Act. Therefore, it has been taken very cautiously by banks located in Hong Kong, whether they're Western banks or Chinese banks. So based on multiple news sources, not surprisingly, the Western banks in Hong Kong have begun their disengagement with political exposed person long before some of them were even officially designated. And Chinese banks have temporarily adopted a compliance measure to avoid dealing with these officials too. Carrie Lam mentioned that her credit card was largely hammered and she's experienced inconvenience here and there. Why did Chinese banks adopt a temporary compliance with US sanctions? And in my opinion, China is trying to prevent US financial sanctions from escalating into a larger scale. The consequence of the 10 prohibitions could cause runs in some Chinese banks and lead to situations such as Chinese bank branches in New York would have to cut ties with the bank's branches in Hong Kong. A full-blown financial war is not impossible if too many Chinese banks are sanctioned. To prevent such confrontations from deepening, Chinese banks also, as we could say, made a very calibrated move. So you can see the current situation is featured by calibrated measures from both sides. However, the official designation specifically based on the Hong Kong Autonomy Act is yet to be seen. And this law grants Trump a lot of flexibilities. And the final scale of targeting could arguably vary by the level of ongoing US-China conflicts, not only seen in Hong Kong, but also in other hotspots. For business communities, here with those being said, what can be done to avoid potential loss? So to protect corporate or business communities from loss by being caught in the middle of US-China conflicts, we'll advise them to reassess their risk exposure. Although the sanction list for the Hong Kong Autonomy Act has yet to be seen, we could already use some good assessment based on its definition and its previous enforcement. So the banks are already doing this, and they have utilized the list of politically exposed persons and negative media persons. When they deem a client to have a high risk, they preemptively exclude them or put them on watch list. For international trading companies, their risk exposure depending on their supply chain and their clients. On either end, if they heavily rely on high-risk banks or companies or distributors, they should consider diverting or reducing their engagement to control risk. Sanctions are strict liability. That means the lack of awareness or intent is not a defense. Organizations are also liable, even if they have robust sanctions programs in place. So there are other occasions, such as if company A sold products to a distributor B or middleman, and this distributor is going to sell this to a final destination that is a sanctioned entity, they could be held liable too. So I'm going to give you some example about this. Between 2008 and 2011, so Epsilon Electronics has involved in trade with this company called Asra International, a distributor that eventually sold the products to Iran. Epsilon was fined 1.5 million by OFAC after OFAC deemed that Epsilon should have known that, because Asra, this distributor's website, has touted the company's success in Iran market. And there's a freight record showing a shipping to an address in Iran. So that's example just to show you how sanctions sanction consequences could bring you could put you in a very bad situation, even you didn't have the intent, or maybe you just don't know. But when people when OFAC or other government body have put this fact-based judgment on this, and then you could be held liable. And so let's come back to the situation under Hong Kong related sanctions. I mentioned that based on the definition in these Hong Kong related laws, some banks' industry sectors are at high risk. We know that TikTok withdrew its Hong Kong business and amid the passing of the law. These are specific for those particular sector, but as I mentioned, the worst case scenario would be a large number of banks in Hong Kong being sanctioned, which could lead to a larger scale financial, or in that case, no business is immune to this damage. Therefore, we recommend these companies that have involved in cross-continental trade or investment to conduct a due diligence and to establish to establish programs to identify risks among partners, suppliers, and clients. It is important to analyze the behind-the-scene ownership structure of the companies or partners. Pay attention that companies partially owned by sanctioned entities could be considered as sanctioned targets as well. And OFAC use 50% standard, and I know some banks and companies are getting more and more conservative. They're using 25% or even 10% for additional layer of precaution. So we know Trump administration has found Huawei with military background in China without have to show the evidence. Therefore, it is a good strategy for the companies to take extra layers of precaution. And last, lobbying and legal procedure can't eliminate the necessity of compliance. While compliant, if groups find compliance significantly hurt their business, they should consider alternatives. However, lobbying and legal effort on behalf of sanctioned entities barely went far. There are cases where the sanctioned entities were taken off from the list, which usually requires change in behavior. So going forward, we should learn from the dense history of the sanction playbook to predict and navigate the global sanction landscape. We know that between 2014 and 2015, after Russia annexed Crimea, US imposed 22 sanctions on that region, including sectoral sanctions with a very broad reach in energy and the financial sectors. It is not impossible for US to impose sector-wide sanctions to certain Chinese sectors. And US sanctions over Crimea were also supported by EU sanctions. They both sanctioned some of the same entities, including some construction companies. Now, EU have announced trade restrictions over China's Hong Kong national security law, but it is not likely to impose financial sanctions on this matter. Not imposing financial sanctions would discount its effectiveness on trade restrictions, but these restrictions should still be taken very seriously by international trade players. We are in the midst this reversal or reconfiguration of globalization orders. Companies and business that have benefited from the previous order are now facing the biggest challenges. Watching closely on the change of the political climate and the direction of the conflict should be taken as a priority to control operational risk. All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. It sounds so complicated, and thank you for the very detailed assessment and advice on individuals and business to navigate this rough, emerging, difficult landscape. Yeah. So I certainly hope all the international trade companies and investment companies, they'll set up their dedicated team to for risk assessment to watch the changing U.S.-China conflicts. So now I see there are some questions, and also I have some questions too, and I think we will go from there. It's just kind of go over the time. Let's see. Okay. I see that Mr. Wang has asked this question, and it's the same question as I'm asking, so I'll just go with mine. So basically, with the elections coming up, everyone knows in just a little over a month. I just read from the Wall Street Journal last week. They were saying the Biden team shares the Trump administration's assessment that China is a disruptive competitor. So how do you feel the hostility and sanction measures towards China are going to play out under each administrations? So this question is for both of you. So whoever wants to answer first.
I can join first.
Okay.
So I think for Trump administration, we have already seen how the policies are playing out, right? And if Trump got re-elected, he might relax a little bit, but I'm afraid I think he would still keep a hot line for a while. And compared to Trump, I think Biden's policy towards China might be much more predictable, just based on his history, right? His homework that have been done in U.S. history that we could research on. So he would be more predictable, and he would focus more on strengthening the alliance, and instead of the trade war. So he would he would put more effort on environmental issues and protecting human rights issues. But I think the bottom line is they both would keep a hard line, because U.S.-China conflicts now is surrounded by issues like COVID-19 and human rights issues related to quite a few regions. And I don't see there's a big difference between the two parties' constituents' view on these issues. So that is why I think they both would keep a hotline towards China for a while.
Yeah.
That's my thoughts.
Yeah, Ariane? You have to unmute.
Okay, so I answered a little bit in the chat, but even though it seems like the escalation has been in only recent months, in actuality, it has been building for decades. And so there are two sort of groups. One are critics, of China who didn't want to include them in the fold as much as the pro-engagement group did. And so I think with the rise of President Xi, those two groups have now come a little bit closer together because of certain, actions that he's taken in the political, economic, and foreign policy realm, not to mention the fact that he removed the term limits. But I only can share with you the perspective that I've seen from people in intelligence, community. Generally, regardless of who's president, the officials in the intelligence community stays, although at the very top there are federal appointees, right? And they would make a big difference in terms of the approaches. So at the very least, I think a change in administration would not direct hostility toward people who are trying to address racial discrimination. And as an advocate, I know that it's been very, very difficult to find champions who are members of Congress, congressional committee staff, congressional staff. There are few, but a lot have been swayed because of the ascendance of the critics of China, and nobody wants to be seen as being weak on national defense, but I don't know that they've really gone very deeply to understand the nuances that I've been saying, but the environment is so hostile that they're not even going to entertain those, because of the people that are surrounding them, and that peer pressure. So I can name very specific instances where I was close to getting something on an agenda with a congressional committee, but because the inner champion wasn't in that, was second in command and not first, in that congressional committee, that we couldn't even raise it, okay, or even get a proposal and legislation on a proposed bill. So I'm just going to share that. But for transparency's sake, I do want to say that I am volunteering for the affinity group on the Biden campaign. But right now I'm speaking purely as like an advocate, and my thoughts even before I recently just joined. So for me, it would make a big difference in my advocacy work.
Okay. Yeah, I think you answered a part of my second question, but I'm still going to ask that question. Second question is Asian Americans, there's a trend to disassociate ourselves from the Chinese government or from the Communist Party. So I know some AAPIs, they specifically, when they fill out the census, they want to say, okay, we were identified as Taiwanese American, or we're from Hong Kong, or like we're Korean Americans, Japanese Americans, we're not Chinese, right? And so do you think that strategy works? I think like Asian Americans are very divided on the issue of race in the country. So some feel like although we have a lot of problems with the race, but US is still by far the best country in the world towards immigrants. Some others feel that America is just a racist country. No matter how much you disassociate yourself with China, from Chinese government, you're still going to be discriminated against. So I just want to get your take on that. I think Ariane already answered some of the questions. Yeah, maybe He, you can give a try for this question.
Sure, I'll give a try. So I think you have touched upon a lot of issues that's a little bit different. For example, the anti-Chinese sentiment and anti-Chinese policies and discrimination, they're slightly different issues, right? So for anti-Chinese policies or sentiment, I think if you are a China-born scientist who have been working in very sensitive areas, and no matter who you claim you are, you can claim you're a Korean or Japanese scientist, American scientist, you could still find you're very much likely to find more investigatory attention paid on you compared to other ethnic groups, just as Ariane has illustrated very clearly in her presentation, that you find those what kind of people are most likely to be investigated, right? You have connection with Chinese people or government, you have connection with the institution, and you have been doing sensitive work, right? And some of them even in the federal have been granted fund from the federal government, like NIH. So you're naturally in a group that is most likely to be identified as high risk. So I think for them, it's no matter, you cannot just claim you're someone else to be let noticeable. But I don't think legal, business, and scientific communication and collaboration should be discouraged. And I know that, I know an organization called AAAS. It's the publisher of Science Journal, one of the highest journal in scientific field, as you guys know. So they are trying to establish an office in Beijing just to facilitate the scientific communication and help scientists in China to publish their papers on science. So that's an example that you say there are bridges burning out, but people are also trying to build more bridges elsewhere. And I know this, this is still in the process. I know this because I have a friend, her name is Lauren Seligman. She works in there. She's the point person of this project. And she's got, this endeavor has got a lot of support from people like, you know, Stephen Chu. He's the one major sponsor of this project. So, so I think one thing we should remember that we're granted a lot of rights, like freedom of speech. Some people are concerned about voicing concerns. But I think Asian Americans are granted a lot of rights. Other ethnic groups also are granted to by the Constitution and other laws. So I would say I would not take away my rights before others take it away from me, attempt to take away from me. So I think that's for the anti-Chinese sentiment. The other one, discrimination, you mentioned discrimination against Chinese or other race. Some people think it does not exist. I think I have seen some research that showed more than 20% of Asian Americans have experienced discrimination in finding a job or getting raised or in housing market. So I think there are discriminations everywhere. It could be based on race, gender, age. I feel I'm discriminated because of my age sometimes. So it's everywhere, and we should not just fight for institutional bias if it exists. And we should also fight for internal bias against us. And I think, believe it or not, it could have negative consequences on us and our children. So it's an ongoing battle, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So anything, Ariane, you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I was so engrossed in Wei's answer that I sort of forgot the question, but I think what I heard was you were asking whether it matters or not for someone to downplay their ethnic background. Would the US be more or less racist? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, to disassociate us with the Chinese government.
I see. So this is an age, I mean, a century-old problem that all of Asian Americans have, you know, encountered, which is part of that historical cycle that, you know, I spoke about. And I think that it's only until we come together in coalition across all different ethnic groups to really begin to educate the public. I've spent 20 years trying to address stereotypes and you know, racist comments in the public dialogue, organizing communities. And I've come to the realization that, you know, what we need is something similar to what the Jewish Americans did at the turn of the century, which is to create the Anti-Defamation League. And they did that through periodic polling, through, you know, public campaigns. And I think we need to do a sustained public campaign and you know, resurrect the polling. I think C100 did one 20 years ago, but we need to do that on a periodic, you know, basis and get everybody on board in a very concerted effort, you know, to promote our contributions and our history and our diversity in this country. And so I think the beauty of being in the United States is that you have the opportunity to fix the problems, whereas you, in other countries, you don't necessarily, you know, can do that, right? So, and in terms of the US, I started my career in addressing hate crimes. I didn't know the contours of who's racist and who's not. And it's become extremely more apparent in the last 4 years, and in part also because there's academic studies of people and their profiles, right? And so now we know that what we're living in is actually a country divided. It's almost even, and we even know the geographic regions and the profiles of the people. But I'm in the camp that believes that diversity is our strength. And so it's only in coming together and bringing along the country to see that we're in a globalized world and the US needs to catch up. And the sooner that they embrace the diversity of the populace, the more that we can maintain the competitiveness in the world that people are so concerned about losing.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. I think this in sync with the theme of this convention. Is the API unity. We need to build a coalition so we can be empowered, right? My last question is, that in the past hour, both of you have laid out strategies for us to navigate through this complicated policy and sanction landscape by communicating and influencing the US policies. But what do you feel that we can do as Asian Americans? We put pressure on the China side. I know this is a very sensitive issue, but obviously improvement of relationships should come from both sides. There's just any limited thing that we can do here. But, I've been here for almost 30 years, but I never feel discrimination or the hostility until recent years. So I'm just trying to get your take on this. And is there anything that we can do from here to put some pressures on the other side? So, Wei, or you want to give it a try first?
All right. I think the only way that the simple answer that I have is through communications, right? So not communications at the intergovernmental level, but also from all the other critical levels, especially for the key stakeholders, from the key stakeholders who would bear the major consequence of a worsening US-China relationship, right? So there's a lot of things to do. I think Chinese economy has grown so rapidly in an unprecedented pace in the last few decades, but China is still trying to shape its global position in this world where you see emerging economies are showing their prowess in every aspect. But at the same time, Western institutions, their laws and their cultures are still the dominant force, largely the dominant force in many critical areas. So I think China has been through a lot of things, and they have a lot to learn too. And China has created some miracles and some things for the Western countries to learn too. So I think there's a lot of room to communicate. So if I notice correctly, after August, China has been more open and less aggressive than before in communication with the Western countries. So I think bridge builders like us or AAAS, just as I mentioned, and many other organizations that want these two countries' relationship to become more peaceful and to benefit more people, they should grasp those opportunities as windows to open more doors.
So it's more at the grassroots level, not the governmental level, the grassroots level. So there's a lot of activities that is going on. Yeah, I think that's, I agree on that. Yeah. So Ariane?
Yeah, so I break it down into, what is a personal act of someone voicing their view as opposed to aggregating their voice along with others as the voice of the Chinese American community. And I know, having talked to many people, that this is an intensely personal decision with consequences for them and their families who do live in China, right? So I just want to honor that this is a decision that people have to weigh for themselves. But in terms of, like, as a community, if people decided that they wanted to speak out in support of, like, a democratic value because they enjoy that here in the United States, and just to give a very simplistic, a scenario, say they want to return term limits to the president, or they want to see a freedom of speech, that it would be very powerful, for a headline to say, you know, I think that Chinese Americans, weigh in on this position, right? I think, that would be a very powerful thing. I think the other thing that I'm cognizant about as an advocate that combats hate crimes, and then also raises concerns about the U.S. government's treatment, of Chinese Americans during these investigations, is that the PRC kind of picks up on that and then amplifies that, right? And the ethnic Chinese media, and that it does make me feel uncomfortable, because it's being used, right? It that but the voice of Chinese Americans isn't balanced with a critique, right, of the PRC. So there is a vacuum, and then that actually doesn't reflect as well to the intelligence community looking at the Chinese American community too, because then, it's kind of presumed that that you're sort of in favor, right, of all things related to China, which isn't the case. So that's sort of how I see the issue.
Yeah, I see in the Q&A, Wang Yi is asking if U.S.-China becomes long-term rivalry or enemy, does Chinese American need to develop our identity clearly separated from China? So that's kind of similar to my second question. So do we have like a clear answer, short answer?
All I can tell you is that after World War II, the Japanese Americans came together. They already had the Japanese American Citizens League even before the incarceration camps, but they really came together in a unified way, and they determined that they did not want they wanted to sever ties, basically, with Japan. I mean, I'm not promoting that's the route that people should take, but I'm just saying that over time allowed them to be seen as an American organization. And similarly, OCA, which is an Organization of Chinese Americans, before it became OCA, according to the intelligence community, sees OCA as an organization that is not, a person or community of a suspect, because they hold very strictly to, we do not engage in foreign policy issues, and they've done that for I don't know how long, maybe since their inception in 1972 or 3.
Oh, so they have to make it clear in their mission, they don't want to get involved with the, the country, the international, the bilateral relations, like international relations.
Right? Yeah, because our websites are checked. The organization's websites are checked too.
Okay, yeah, I think that's very important. That's very important. Yeah. So I have the second question is Zhu Xiaobing. He's asking, would a representative of a US company in China be subject to scrutiny? They are inevitably participate in some Chinese government sponsored events. Representative of a US company in China, would they be subject to scrutiny?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, really good question, because there's a sizable business community, a US business community in China, and they necessarily have to interact, right, with officials. And I'm not sure how that's handled. I mean, I only know of cases where people based in the US have traveled there, and even for a short period of time, they try to log into their company's server from China because they're trying to do work, and that gets them in a heap of problem. But if you're there, living there, based there, I'm not sure how the government treats those Americans.
Wow.
So I would think if it's depend on what kind of government-sponsored event they go, right? If it's related to some sensitive information exchange, that would be different from a trade promotion gala, right? So I would think when law enforcement get into this kind of situations, there would be still big distinctions, they could say.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Is there any more questions? Well, no more. Let me see. Let me double check the chat box. Wow, very good conversation. I learned a lot myself too. So, okay. Let's now. I think we're at the. Let's conclude this session. Oh, there's a one chat. Let me see what they're saying. Thank you, thank you. Okay, yes. Let's conclude this session, and we're just thank you for NCLF for giving us this opportunity. I think it's that we learned a lot and we share a lot of information. And thank you for both of you, Ariane and Wei, and we should work together and we should do more of this. I think it's really benefit the community. Okay, thank you.
Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you for everyone to stay this late and listen to us. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you, Wei. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Yeah.